Hello and welcome to Law and Omen. My name is Kristin and I'm alone this week. Chanel is not able to record because she's busy with studies and other things, so I figured why not do a minisode. It's really strange to be recording by myself. Instead of skipping a week, we thought, why not a minisode? So this week I'm going to be covering the story of Saartjie Baartman. You might be thinking, this is a paranormal and true crime podcast, right? So why are you covering her story? While there might not be any paranormal aspect to the story, this is still a South African story that needs to be told. This is a story of a woman indigenous to our country who had to endure some awful things. So her story deserves to be told, and frankly, there's a tiny law aspect to it, so, which I will get into as I go. So I'm going to start, obviously, in the beginning. So let's get into it. Sara Baartman was born in around 1789. It's believed she was from the Gutmoos River region in the Eastern Cape. Her birth name is unknown, but she was part of the I just realized I didn't practice pronouncing any words. Here we go. She was part of the Gonaquasub tribe of the Khoikhoi people. This was a time of colonization in South Africa, and Sara grew up on a colonial farm where it's likely her family were servants. Sara's mother died when she was around 2 years old, and it said her father died when she was a young girl. Sara went on to marry a Khoikhoi man, and they had a child together. But unfortunately, the baby died shortly after its birth. At some point, the Dutch and Khoikhoi got involved in a conflict, and Khoikhoi people were thus absorbed into the labor system. When Sara was only 16 years old, her husband was murdered by Dutch colonists. Soon after all of this, and all alone, Sara was sold into slavery under Pieter Willem Cesar. Cesar took Sara to Cape Town, where she became a domestic servant of his brother. This was the time that Sara was given the Dutch nickname Saartjie, which is like the diminutive form of Sarah. So like I said, her birth name is unknown, and I'm not sure if Baartman was her husband's surname. So while she was a slave for Cesar, it is said that Sara, quote, signed a contract with William Dunlop, a Scottish ship surgeon, and this was supposed to have been done on the 29th of October in 1810. But, when a slave signs a contract, does that really mean anything? You don't really have consent, so what is the point of any sort of contract? It doesn't really matter if you're a slave, does it? Dunlop was a friend of Cesar and his brother. So the apparent terms of this contract was that Sara would travel with Cesar and Dunlop to Ireland and England to work as a domestic servant and to be exhibited. It was said that she would receive a portion of earnings from these exhibitions and that she would be allowed to go back to South Africa after 5 years. Another reason that the signing of a contract is questionable is that Sara was illiterate, and also her culture didn't keep any sorts of written records. She'd never even seen a contract before. It's also alleged that the Cesar family were going through financial issues and wanted to use Sara to make money for themselves. So, why did these men want Sara to go with them so badly? And why did they want to exhibit her? Being an African woman, Sara was obviously darker than the European people, but she also had physical features that were mostly unusual to them. Her buttocks were large and pronounced. She also had large breasts, and her proportions were just different to Europeans. These Europeans also considered themselves superior to the black and Khoi people they were encountering. They saw themselves as better, more cultured and sophisticated, and more intelligent. So Sara was sadly taken to London and was displayed in Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly. She was exhibited half naked in a cage where men and women paid to come and see her. The cage was only around 1.5 meters high, which is shorter than I am. That's not very big at all. I'm not too sure how tall Sara was, but that's still... First of all, she's being put in a cage, and she's also being put in a small cage, so it's bad all around. Sara was exhibited in Bury St. Edmunds, Colchester, and Manchester while she was in England, and she was also apparently baptized while she was there. While Sara was in England, Britain was in the middle of a campaign against slavery. The way she was being exhibited got attention from the African Association, who saw what was being done to her as exploitation, which it was. Cesar and Dunlop were brought to trial for the apparent injustices. However, there were no consequences. Shocker! They got out of any trouble because they had a contract that she had allegedly signed. This is a quote. Her contract was, however, amended, and she became entitled to better conditions, greater profit share, and warm clothes. Which in itself just shows how badly she was treated. Better conditions? What, better than a cage? Warm clothes? Yeah, because all she was allowed to wear was that little loincloth. She was mostly naked all of the times that she was displayed. Remember, she comes from South Africa. She is now taken to England. She's taken to all these cold places, and she's just paraded around in basically nothing. So yeah, warm clothes was probably something she really appreciated. Sara spent 4 long years going through this in London. In September 1814, Cesar transported Sara from England to France in the care of a man named Henry Taylor. There she was sold to S. Rieu, who was a man who showcased animals. Rieu made money by exhibiting Sara around Paris for a duration of around 15 months, and she was presented alongside actual animals, such as a baby rhinoceros. Rieu, her quote, trainer, would give her commands to sit or stand, as if she herself was a trained animal. She was usually displayed almost totally naked. However, she was allowed to cover her lower genitals with a tan loincloth. She was given the name Hottentot Venus, and Hottentot is a derogatory term for the Khoikhoi people. And just that alone indicates the way she was seen. She was being degraded, but then she was also being called Venus, who is a beautiful goddess. So these people had this sort of sexual attraction to how different she was, but yet in the same breath looked down at her and saw her as less than they were. After some time, Sara attracted the attention of a naturalist named George Cuvier. Cuvier had obviously seen some of these exhibitions, and then he asked Rieu if he could study Sara as a scientific specimen, and Rieu agreed. I'm not sure if there was an exchange of money involved in this, but most likely. So from around March 1815, French anatomists, physiologists, and zoologists studied poor Sara. Cuvier stated that Sara was, quote, a link between animals and humans, and he used her as sort of proof that Africans are a lesser race. So just all around great people. Sara was only 26 years old when she died in 1816. The actual cause of her death is unknown. However, it's speculated that it was a respiratory illness such as pneumonia, smallpox, or alcoholism. I imagine that since she was a slave, she would only have access to things if it was given to her. So I'm not sure if part of her displays, or just to keep her at bay, perhaps her, quote, owners would feed her alcohol or, make her drink to get her into a state where she was easier to handle. I'm not sure. That's just my thought on it. It's bad. It's a terrible situation. Once she was dead, Cuvier was not done with her body. He obtained Sara's corpse and created a plaster cast of her body. He had her body right after she died, and he didn't bother to do an autopsy to determine why she died. He was just interested in her actual body, in dissecting it, in, quote, scientifically examining it. What Cuvier did is that he removed and pickled her brain and genitals. Her genitals were a big focus for people because, again, she was very sexualized. People thought she was so unusual, and she didn't look like what Europeans saw around them. They saw the darker people that they brought as slaves as exotic and unique and different, but looked down on them, and these people were exploited in many ways. I didn't see any records of sexual abuse, but I imagine that Sara was exposed to a lot of that. I imagine that these people, they were paying to come and see her. They were paying to see these exhibits. Perhaps in secret, Cuvier was letting people pay to engage in sexual acts with her. I don't know. I imagine that this was a terrible time for her and she was going through the worst of it all. It's unlikely to me that these European men from this time would bother taking her just to show her around in a cage. It's a sad thought, but it's most likely what happened. So once Cuvier was done creating the plaster cast and dissecting her, Sara's remains were obtained by Geoffrey St. Hilaire for the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle d'Angers, where it was displayed. I probably butchered that pronunciation, but oh well. While on display, Sara's skull was stolen in 1827, but a couple of months later it was returned. Her remains were then moved to the Musée de l'Homme, which was founded in 1937, and I think that's called the Museum of Man. The way she was displayed was that her body cast and her skeleton were standing side by side, with her rear facing the viewers. And this was to enforce the fact that her butt was the main feature. This was the thing that everyone came to see because it was so unusual. This exhibit, rightfully so, was eventually seen as a degrading representation of woman, and her skeleton was then removed from the display in 1974. Her body cast was only removed from that display in 1976. So this poor woman died in 1816, and her body was on display until 1976. That is a long time to just have your body be stared at. She was taken from South Africa when she was around 16, and she died when she was 26. So she spent around 10 years being paraded around and exhibited and exploited and humiliated, almost a decade of that. And then, for so many years after her death, she was still being gawked at and exhibited and displayed, and people paying to come and see her body. And it's just sad that she wasn't shown respect as a human being. She was an object, she was a sexual object, which is just awful. So then, in 1994, after Nelson Mandela became president, he requested that France release Sara's body so that she could be repatriated to South Africa. But the French didn't really want to do this, because if they were going to basically return a, quote, exhibit to the country it comes from, then that would open them up to having to return other exhibits to other countries, where it didn't really belong to them. They didn't want that. And also, if they did, they would have to acknowledge and admit to the way that they have been displaying her and the wrong that they had been doing, and they didn't want to do that. So 8 years after Nelson Mandela requested it, the French finally relented and released her body. The 6th of March 2002, Sara Baartman's body was returned to the Eastern Cape in South Africa. She was buried there on the 9th of August 2002, on Women's Day, in Hankie in the Eastern Cape. While Sara Baartman was not the only Khoikhoi person to have been taken from their home during that time, she is an icon because of what she endured. She was treated like an animal, as a subhuman, which displays the racism of the time. These men preyed on a very young woman who had lost almost everyone she loved at a young age. They then abused and subjected her to humiliation and trauma for the rest of her very short life. Sara Baartman was more than her body. She was a human being, and she mattered. It's very unfortunate that stories like these even exist. Thankfully, society has improved a bit since then. It is sad to think that Sara Baartman was effectively the first South African woman to be the victim of sex trafficking. Again, I couldn't find records of actual sexual assault or abuse, but I'm going to bet money on the fact that that happened, which is sad. This woman lost her parents when she was young. She lost her baby. She lost her husband. By the age of 16, she lost all of that. She was probably broken and alone. I don't know if she had other family. And then she was she was bought as an object by these men. She was supposed to have been bought as a slave to clean up, but no, they focused on her body, sexualized and exploited this young girl across the freaking globe. They took her to Britain, to France, and they just treated her like crap. And that's a terrible, terrible story. But it's something that we should remind ourselves about. It's something that we should talk about and remember. Her story should never be forgotten. Gender-based violence and sexual assault towards women is such a huge issue in South Africa. So that's why it's really important to think about these stories, think about the history of the women of this country. What did the women before us go through? Especially during the time when people were coming from another country and just taking what they want, fighting with indigenous people, all in the name of colonization. It's something that we should remember and consider going forward as a society. So let's not forget her. So that's the very sad story of Sara Baartman. And I didn't call her by the nickname Saartjie because that's not her name. That's a nickname that these people gave to her. We don't even know if her name was Sara to begin with. But just out of respect to her, I didn't want to refer to her by that nickname. She is more than what these people try to make her out to be. So, yeah, that's our first Minisode. I hope you, I don't want to say enjoyed it, but I hope you at least got something out of listening to it. If you have any questions or requests or want to send your stories in, you can contact us at info@lawandOmen.com. We're on Spotify, Deezer, iTunes, Amazon Music, so many more. If you can't find us on a platform you would prefer, please let us know and we will do our best to see if we can get our podcast there. Also, if you struggle to listen on any of the other platforms, you can listen directly from our website, lawandOmen.com. We'll be back to our regular longer length episodes from next week when Chanel returns. So until then, stay safe, be good to each other, and have an amazing week.